and we are going to go out to Mississippi. We are talking with Hannah. She, her pronouns, is a theist. And you want to talk about materialism and physicalism. Well, I'm all for it, Hannah. You are on the Atheist Experience, and what you got for us?
So basically, I would like to argue against materialism and physicalism. Correct me if I'm mistaken, but my understanding is that you two hold to the position of materialism and physicalism metaphysically. So correct me if that's mistaken.
I would say materialism, probably. Methodological materialism for sure. I'm not in the boat of saying that like just we know for sure that there's nothing out there that's non-material, but it does seem to be the best way to operate so far. Physicalism and materialism are a little bit different, and I would not necessarily call myself a physicalist. But we don't need to go through all those nuances because I think we can probably have a good discussion with that. But does that help, Hannah?
That makes sense. I was just curious if you did subscribe. But of course, when I asked whether you subscribe to it, I'm not asking if you believe it's 100% like certain. It's just like if you generally.
Right, but that's an important distinction to make, though, before we continue the conversation. And I'm kind of in the same boat as SR. You know, I prefer to call myself a practical materialist. Right, as a matter of practice, we can identify material things and have not, to my knowledge, been able to identify or justify belief in the non-material in the way that I think you're suggesting, and so. So I think it's pretty much the same as what SR was saying. Okay.
So the first line of criticism that I believe makes materialism, even methodological materialism, untenable is what David Chalmers calls the hard problem of consciousness. So are you familiar with the distinction he makes between the hard problem and soft problem of consciousness?
I think so, but if you'd like to give us a quick wrap, I mean, that'd be great for all our viewers.
Yeah, so basically the quick wrap, as I understand his position, and I think it makes sense, is that there's a difference between, you can say, the soft problem of consciousness, which is basically certain like functional interactions between the brain, and what he calls the hard problem of consciousness, which is the essential difference between what's considered, qualia, which is essentially the experience or subjectivity of experience, versus a physical object. Like there's something about the experience of redness that is not reducible to, say, looking at like a piece of like a physical molecule or like a quark or a lepton, right? So there's basically a difference between intentionality and aboutness of consciousness. And so I would argue that means that materialism, which as I understand denies the existence of consciousness as an immaterial thing, untenable.
As a material, yeah. Okay, so my question would be why?
Well, because if consciousness doesn't exist, then I don't believe you can account for the aboutness of consciousness in qualia.
Cool. I'm glad that you don't believe that. My question is, though, how is that something that undermines materialism? What it sounds to me like you're saying, and please just correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds to me like what you're saying is that this system, materialism, seemingly has this little hole in it, and therefore all of it is BS. And that may be the case very much, right? But you just have to make that connection. Just because materialism currently does not explain to the full degree what consciousness is, does not mean that the entire system is flawed. It may, but you just got to demonstrate that for us. So how does that undermine all of materialism because we don't have an answer for what consciousness is right now? And I think we do have good answers, by the way, but I'm willing to grant the hard problem of consciousness. I've heard some cool people talking, some people even talking with Mr. Chalmers himself, that the hard problem of consciousness isn't actually real. But we don't have to even go that route today. So what about the hard problem of consciousness not being solved undermines all of materialism?
Well, because if materialism posits there's no such thing as consciousness,
What I wouldn't say that it does
everything
that. So hang on. I think there's an assumption that you're not bringing to the forefront, and it's okay because we all do this, right? But I think you're assuming to begin with that consciousness is immaterial. And that's the problem. If you're already starting with the presupposition that consciousness is immaterial, then clearly there would be a problem with it. That would be the way that it undermines. That's the connection, right? So what you would say is you'd say, hey, SR, we know that consciousness is immaterial. And because materialism does not have the ability to account for immaterial things, and we know consciousness is a thing and it's immaterial, boom, materialism falsified. But the problem is that you then have to take the stance that consciousness is immaterial.
Let me add something into that too, Hannah, before you respond to that. Would you say, if we set aside the question of consciousness for a second, if instead I asked you something along the lines of, do you think that the existence of running, do you think that would disprove materialism? Because running, I think we can agree, is not a material thing, although it is an activity or a characteristic, or however you want to describe it, of material. The idea of, you move your legs in a certain way for a certain amount of time for a certain speed, that's running. Okay. And so would you say that the existence of running discredits materialism in that same way as you're talking about consciousness?
Well, so that's where I believe that question would depend on what type of materialism we're talking about. I would believe if materialism, as defined as a non-physicalist materialism, running would disprove, not in like reductive materialism, I should say, because running involves energy, which is not the same as matter. To my understanding, many physicists would say energy and matter are distinct properties, and so I would say yes, running would disqualify materialism, but not disqualify physicalism. But
I don't think there's any materialists here that will disagree with the existence of energy.
Yeah, and I would push back a little bit and just say that the relation of energy becoming matter and matter becoming energy, like we have a decent understanding of that shit happening, like explosions occur, right? So like some of that matter turns into sound, some of it turns into light. And so, I mean, but again, let's reframe a little bit and let's go back to consciousness. Do you take the stance that consciousness is immaterial? Because I think that's a really interesting thing for us to kind of pick at a little bit more.
Well, yes, and the reason is precisely the reasoning of the hard problem of consciousness, that if there's an essential difference between how the subjective experience of phenomena and something that can be quantified objectively in like a physical spatio-temporal sense, like say, like an atom, for example. You can see an atom directly, but you can't see consciousness.
Oh, I don't know if you cut out there for a second. You still with us, Hannah?
Cut out.
No, it's okay. It's okay. It's good. I think no, you're good. I think I'm following along with you, but I want to know if you remember saying this. You said if, Hannah. Do you remember that?
Well,
when you started describing all of this, you said if consciousness is immaterial. And I'm with you, Hannah. If consciousness is shown to be immaterial, then a lot of these things you're talking about may actually prove to be true. But what if it isn't? And the big question is it currently proven to be such? And I think there is a growing consensus in many of the fields of expertise that would be able to understand and parse this data for us. I think there is a growing consensus that no, it is not immaterial, that it is a sliding scale, that life seems to have varying degrees of consciousness based on almost exclusively based on the physical makeup of a neural system. Now, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think that makes great fucking sense. But I could be an idiot. I sure could be. But what do you think about that?
Well, so I would just say that I don't remember putting the qualifier if, although I did. I'm sure I did. If I
Well,
did,
just
I would like
rewatch.
to
I could be wrong. I'll rewatch too. Yeah, I just rewatch, but yeah.
Okay. But yeah, if I said if, yeah, I think I may have misphrased my point. I think it's clear consciousness has to be immaterial, but the reason is because I don't believe you can look at qualia through a test tube. Like I don't see how you could falsify what it means to see brightness through a test.
And that's fair.
Like,
and I understand that, but real quick, I just want to say, like, it's not to say that you're wrong, Hannah. It's just to say that's not actually an argument against the thing I'm saying. Like, if somebody comes up to me and says, I have a bunny rabbit, and I go, yeah, I just can't see how anybody could own a bunny. They take so much effort. They poop everywhere. They're smelly. They have big fluffy ears. I just can't understand how you could do that. That isn't a response to them saying, I own a bunny rabbit. Just like me saying, hey, like, what if that isn't the case? You going, yeah, I just can't really see how you could do that. That doesn't actually give us reason to accept your claim.
Or did you misstate your response?
Well,
did you mean to say, I just don't see?
Sorry, what was that?
I apologize if I'm interrupting. Did you mean to say, because you started out that last little bit by saying, I don't see how. Was that a misstatement, or did you mean that part?
I meant that part, but the reason is because I think you'd need to be able to provide like an example of a falsifiable experiment, and I think falsifiability is an important criterion in science, a falsifiable experiment for how qualia emerges from physical processes such that it can be fully reduced to physical processes.
Did you catch the problem, Scott?
I caught a problem.
You think? Okay, I'm gonna let Scott go for a second, Hannah, because I caught something there too that I'd grab. But go ahead, Scott. I'll shut up.
It was very subtle. If you're not paying attention, you might miss it. Did you detect a shifting of the burden of proof there? Basically what you're saying is we need to provide a counterexample. Otherwise, you're going to accept that what you're saying is true. Is that what you meant to say, or are we?
That was what I caught. That was exactly what I caught, Scott.
All right.
Yeah.
That worries me that we're on the same vibe here, the same wavelength. But we'll press on.
Yeah. What do you think? What do you think about that, Hannah?
So you correct me if I'm wrong. Did you just say that me asking for how consciousness would emerge in a falsifiable experiment is shifting the burden of proof?
No, what I was saying is that we were asking you why does that show that consciousness can't be, or why would it show that it has to be immaterial? And your response was, well, you have to ... Okay, and that, to me, that doesn't seem like a very above board way of showing your point. Your point shouldn't depend on what SR and Scott can or can't do or say.
Right. Just real quick, and I'll shut up, I swear. If what you're saying is demonstrably true, then the answer is to demonstrate it, not to say, hey guys, why don't you try and knock down my tower? If your tower can withstand the strongest of forces, all you have to do is grab a sledge and start hitting it. You don't need us to do anything. And in fact, asking us to do something games the system, right? This is the whole point with James Randi bringing in the magicians to fool the scientists. The scientists were under strict instructions never to let the magicians touch the machines. And every single one of them did not follow that. And the moment the magician touched the machine, they were able to manipulate it in a way that when the scientists turned back around to them and said, hey, why don't you show us that you can levitate things? The magician said, well, why don't you prove that I can't? That is not the way to truth.
Right.
I'll shut up now, Hannah. I know I shouted a lot, but I'm going to give you some time. So go ahead.
I believe that's a mistaken analogy in this case with regards to consciousness being immaterial. And the reason is because, so as I understand materialism in a philosophical sense, so there's two distinctions here. You can make metaphysical materialism, which says everything is matter, and methodological materialism, which says everything, like, correct me if I'm mistaken, but as I understand, methodological materialism says everything which can be observed has to be appear in a material way to the senses.
Incorrect.
So that's
Incorrect.
my understanding. Was that?
Yeah, I would say that is not the proper way to understand methodological materialism. Okay, so what I would say is a better, and I could absolutely be completely wrong on this, Hannah. Okay, please check me, double check me, triple check me, ask 1,000 other people, right? But the way that I think about it is more so in the sense of currently, all of the different camps out there that are attempting to move towards truth, we can agree on this one thing, and that is material stuff is here. We may not be sure how it got here. It may not be the only thing, but we don't get to bring in anything else until it can adhere to the same provability and falsifiability that we have with the one thing we are all standing on, agreeing upon, which is material stuff. Is that fair? Is that a fair understanding?
It might be. I haven't spoken to many. Most people who I hear call themselves materialists who I've heard identify as what you could consider ontological materialists. So they commit themselves to the idea that only matter is real. So I don't know too much about
I've heard a lot of ontological materialists too. Not saying they're not real, not saying they're not valid, none of that stuff. But let's just not worry about anybody else. Just you and me, Hannah. You say, SR, are you a materialist? And I go, well, kinda. I'm this methodological materialism, and this is what I mean by that. How do you feel about that? And do you think that's a fair way for us to navigate the world?
And I would also throw in that if you want to show that materialism is not the case, then you would need to be able to address multiple, all the different forms of materialism, including what SR was just describing.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Are you finished?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. So what I would respond to that is, first, I would disagree with the premise that everyone agrees that matter exists. There are people. This is a pretty small minority of the population, but they do exist who are complete idealists, right? In a metaphysical sense, for example, the philosopher and cognitive science Donald Hoffman says that physical matter is an illusion, that everything is observer dependent on consciousness.
I am not positive. I believe I have Donald Hoffman's book just in the other room, and I've only gotten through a decent portion of it. I don't think if you asked Donald Hoffman if he thinks matter is not real, I highly, highly doubt he would say, no, matter does not exist. I think he would couch that in a lot of deep explanation about what's going on with our rods and cones in our eyes and the wiring in our brains. But I think if you asked the man point blank, are coffee cups real? He's going to say, yeah. I don't think he disagrees that matter is real. I could be mistaken. I sure could be. But like I said, I've only gotten through half of that book, but I'm pretty sure he does agree that I do not think there is an idealist that says all matter is actually non-existent and it is just thoughts. I don't think that, but I could be wrong. So,
well, okay. I thought he believed that matter is observer dependent. So I could be wrong. I'd have to look more. I haven't completed it. Yeah.
I love the humility from all sides, Hannah. I think that's always one thing. If any of us are wrong and anybody can tell us, please call in, tell us, post comments, all that good stuff. But anywho, I'm sorry. We've gotten a little derailed, and that's partly my fault. But yeah, let's go forward with the understanding of methodological materialism that I presented, and let's talk about consciousness through that lens. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But anyway, so to respond to your about what you described as what you consider to be methodological materialism, I would say the flaw in that, beyond the question of whether or not there are some people who deny the existence of matter, is that even if everyone accepted the existence of matter, I think you can also make a case for the inclusion of like non-material ways of you could say knowing or understanding,
Like what?
using various philosophical arguments. So
Like
I would
what?
give well, then let me, because there's multiple things that I can say.
Let's give one.
Demonstrate the
Just
existence of non-material.
start. Hang on, Hannah. Just start with one, and let's investigate that together for a second, and then we'll grab another one if we have time. But let's just start with one. What is one non-material way that you think materialists have to accept in terms of coming to knowledge or something?
Numbers, the existence of abstract numbers.
Okay, numbers are a description of the universe around us. So they do have a physical material component that is necessary for them to exist. If nothing exists in the world, if all material doesn't exist, we don't have numbers. Is that fair?
Well, that might be the
numbers
case,
just
but that would still
describe
mean
things.
That's not necessarily true. So could I just provide the argument for numbers being immaterial? And then,
Sure.
Okay. So I don't. So I haven't completed the paper myself, but I have read parts of it. But I was reading about what's considered the Quine-Putnam. It's called the indispensability argument for mathematics. But basically, in this, the logicians Willard Van Orman Quine and Hilary Putnam argued that when analyzing the laws of physics, non-material or non-physical abstract object of numbers have to be assumed methodologically because our best theories in physics rely on the existence of consistent mathematical formulas, which are not